Welcome. My name is Ann Dolan, and today we're talking about executive function skills. What exactly are they, and why do they matter so much in your child's education? For the last 27 years, my team and I have been helping kids to develop their executive functions long before they were even called that. We kind of call them study skills. But it doesn't really matter what they're called or the severity of the issues your child has. What really matters is that there are things we can do to make them better. And in fact, executive functions are kind of like the thing that people don't think about when it comes to school performance. Often we see that kids maybe struggle with motivation. So it's easy to think maybe my child is unmotivated, they're lazy, they don't really care. But really, underlying all that typically is executive function issues. So, Kathy, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here with me today.
Hi, Ann. You know, I love these conversations that we have together.
I know that you do. I feel really grateful to work with Kathy on a daily basis. She and I work together here at Educational Connections, where she's an education specialist. And every day she talks to parents. And she's the perfect person to do this role because she was a teacher for many, many years, 27 years within the Connecticut public school system. And she has a master's degree in education and also a 6 year in educational leadership. But I first met Kathy when she came to us as a coach. She was actually an executive function coach working directly with kids. And over time, it ended up that she started to work on our team, our administrative team. And so, Kathy, your role now is talking to parents every day. What exactly do you do?
That's right. I talk to parents every day, all day, and parents either use a link and put themselves on my calendar. Sometimes they just call in. And typically it's an information-based phone call. So parents call looking for support, looking for help, sometimes just looking for information about executive function or ADHD. But they present sort of what I call a profile of their student, and they share the needs and the concerns and the challenges. And then the first thing I always do is sort of normalize for the parent, because every child we know is unique, but a lot of the things that people say to me are very typical of students with executive function issues or ADHD. And then we start to talk about, if they were going to work with us, what we could do to support them and to intervene to facilitate success for the child.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathy. So I know parents share a lot with you. What are some of the things that they say about their child?
Yeah, so we have a couple of things up here, and there are many more, but these are probably the most popular. So when a parent calls, they talk about being disruptive in class. So for an elementary student, that could be not staying in the chair, running around the classroom, poking other kids, right? A middle school student might want to be the class clown or might want to kind of defy the teacher a little bit. Sometimes they say they can't get their ideas on paper. So they've got great ideas, or they're very verbally articulate, but when it comes to putting it on paper, they get stuck. They're overwhelmed with schoolwork, and someone put this in our chat at the beginning of the session. Students with executive function issues, it looks like a mountain to them. What might not look like that to us, right? So, and then they get very overwhelmed and they shut down. Parents talk a lot. They call in very often and say, this was my student who was getting straight A's, and now all of a sudden we're hovering around a D and we're concerned. They're resistant to help, especially from the parent. I say this to every parent because they say, well, they're not really interested in what I have to say. I've been doing this job for several years, and I still have yet to have a parent call and say, my student loves working with me. My own kids wouldn't work with me, and I was a teacher. So I say we just have to swallow our pride. Poor study habits is another big one that I hear about. Parents say, I don't think my child was taught how to study, like in a very specific, strategic way. And there's a lot of procrastination. And this can be for a variety of different reasons. But obviously, once a student starts to procrastinate, that's when we get into that negative cycle of, not getting things done, not turning things in, and it becomes a kind of a big bad snowball.
Yeah, and Kathy, all these things can be related to executive function. So I'm wondering if you can kind of boil it down for us.
Yeah, of course. So executive function skills, they're like the foundational cognitive processes that support goal-directed behavior. So we have a couple of examples up here on the screen, but if you think of time management, and again, all these things came up in the chat at the beginning of our session, right? So time management is the student's ability to get things done on time, to realize how long it takes to do something, right? Organization could be organization of physical objects, like what books do you need? What folders do you need? It could also be digital files. It could also be a piece of writing. How do you organize your thoughts in a piece of writing? Self-checking is another big one. This one typically comes in around written work. I was a middle school English teacher, so this was a big one for me. But students often, they don't go back and check, right? But this can also be a metacognitive process of checking. For example, you're reading something. Am I understanding what I'm reading? And I mean, as an adult, it happens to me, especially if I take a book to bed at night, forget it. I read half a chapter and I go back and say, I don't think I even understood what I was reading, right? Working memory is really significant here too. And working memory is the ability to hold on to something in your head that you're going to need to use either a few minutes later or a bit longer later. A quick example might be something like, let's say a younger student is doing a math problem and they say, there are 2 horses in this paddock and 3 in the other. So now they have to hold on to that number 5 in their head. And a couple steps further in the process, it might say, how many animals altogether at the farm? They can't remember the 5 to begin with, right? So they can't use it to proceed in the problem. Older kids, it might be with reading. They might be reading, they might have read a couple of sections of a social studies text, for example, and then they need that information to understand what's coming next, and they can't call it back. And then flexible thinking is another executive function skill that's often problematic. This comes into problem solving, ability to think outside the box, but it's also involved with things like transitioning. So for younger kids, like transitioning from one activity to another. And if any student that's struggling with executive function skills has these issues, but if a student has ADHD and it's manifesting with executive function skills, flexible thinking can be particularly problematic because you get into things like hyper focus, where a student just gets riveted on one thing and it's almost physically impossible to get them to stop that activity to move on to something else.
A lot of what you're describing seems to be consistent with ADHD, especially the inattentive type. What's the difference between that and executive function skills?
Yeah, it's a great question. So ADHD is, a physiologic brain wiring, if you will, issue involving brain chemicals and things like that. But if a student has ADHD, they 100% have issues with executive function. Now, we also have thousands of people that just have executive function issues, and we're going to get into that and when the brain develops to catch up with those things that don't have a diagnosis at all. And from our perspective, when we're working with kids and helping kids, we don't need a diagnosis. We don't care if there's a diagnosis because we're still going to support, we're still going to intervene in a way that helps the student. But I do always say to parents, if it's significantly impacting what's happening in school, you might want to talk to the school about investigating a diagnosis, because then they, could have access to a 504 plan, which would give them accommodations to more effectively access curriculum and show what they know how to do, right? Instead of being in this situation where they're quite capable, but they just can't perform because of these limitations.
That makes sense, Kathy. Well, what happens when one of these things gets stuck? Because this looks like, gears that churn together, and you can have a lot of things going well, but if you don't have great time management, what does that look like, for example?
Yeah. So in an ideal world, we'd love for all of these to go well, right? And some people, even people with executive function issues or people with ADHD, they are stronger in one of these areas than another. But think about, for example, so let's take someone who's really good at time management, okay? And they get their work done on time. They actually can sense how much time it takes to get something done. They're mapping out their activities. They're okay with that, but they're completely disorganized. So think of a student with the backpack full of random papers and the book that doesn't come to school and can't find anything. The room is a mess, the locker's a mess, etc. So now that student sits down to work at night and they sit down, oh, I don't have my laptop. I don't have a writing utensil. I don't have the rubric from the teacher. So what should have taken them 15 minutes, and they budgeted for that because they have good time management skills, now it takes at least a half an hour because they ran around the house looking for all the things they needed. So you can see how if they're not all working together, there's sort of a trickle down effect that impacts everything in a negative way.
Yeah, that really makes sense. I've seen that a lot with students that I've worked with over the years too.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, lots of good things can happen when you kind of get those gears churning together.
Absolutely. So, some of the great things that can happen, obviously, achievement at school improves. Negative behaviors are reduced. So, if a student is struggling, they're going to act out, right? Because especially like a middle school student, might sort of want to play tough, instead of admitting like I'm really having a problem here. So you get some of those negative behaviors. But once the student starts to build the skills and they don't feel overwhelmed, they don't feel anxious, the behavior improves. And it also really improves emotional and physical health because if you're not anxious, you're not depressed, you're not feeling poorly about yourself, everything else emotionally and physically picks up, right? And I know when you and I were talking a couple of days ago, we were talking about examples. So I wanted to share two quick examples of
Sure.
students that I've had, and I'm going to do a quick elementary example and then a middle school level. So when things start to work properly, so I was thinking of a student, a little boy that I worked with, started with me in second grade, super capable, funny, energetic, great little guy, but he was also very tech savvy. So he was constantly, muting me or him or putting on a pig nose in the middle of the session or, doing all these behaviors that he thought were hilarious, but were keeping us from getting work done. So we came up with an agreement and a plan that he had to work for 10 minutes. We started with small pieces. We may even have started it with 5, but let's say 10 minutes. And then he could have 2 minutes to play with all the items on the screen. So we started to get into this habit and this routine. He didn't love it at first, but he eventually started to buy in. And then there was a day where I got a little silly and I put on like dog ears or something on the screen and he called me out on it. He said, "It's not time for that. We haven't finished the 10 minute." I was thrilled because obviously he'd internalized that habit, right? And that's what we're looking for students to start to make these things more habitual so that it doesn't have that negative impact. And at a higher level, I had a middle school student, I think about 8th grade. And it was a young lady who was a little bit resistant to my advice at the beginning, or my ideas, I should say. And I had given her a template for tracking assignments. So what you have to do, how long it's going to take, when are you going to do it? And she was polite. She said, "Oh, sure, sure." I didn't see hide nor hair of it for a couple of weeks. And all of a sudden, maybe 3 weeks later, she comes back to the session and said, "I want to show you something." And she had redesigned the template that I had created and was using it. So again, I was thrilled because she hadn't put it in the bottom of the backpack and forgotten about it. She wanted to try something, but she didn't want it to be mine. She wanted it to be hers. And that is so developmentally appropriate, right? So it gives a student autonomy, but also she made it her own, which means, again, she has internalized it. It's become more habitual, and she found a tool that was working for her and bringing her success.
I love that, Kathy. It kind of speaks to, sometimes when kids start with us, the parent really knows that they need help and the child's very resistant. And then once you earn trust and develop that relationship, they are absolutely willing to try things that they weren't in the
Yeah,
beginning. For sure. So thank you for that. All
sure.
right. So another thing to keep in mind is that there is certainly a continuum for executive functions. When kids are really young, like 4, we don't expect them to clean their room perfectly or to organize a shelf. But as they get older, we do expect those things to happen. Why is it that you have to be 25 to rent a car?
Yeah, thank goodness, right? Because the part of the brain that controls executive function, it's called the prefrontal cortex. It is the last part of the brain to develop in all of us. Okay. So this is why, teenagers tend to be little riskier in their behavior or their decision making because they don't have the control system that's saying that's probably not a good idea, right? But one of the statistics that I often share that to this day, every time I say it, I just think it's so profound is if a student, so first of all, you have that part of the brain that's not totally developed, and the kids are being asked to do some pretty complex tasks, right? But if someone has ADHD, that part of the brain can be 3 years behind chronological age. So just think about that for a second. So you have a 7th grade student who's now in middle school, who's probably going to 6 or 7 classes a day, 6 or 7 different teachers, 6 or 7 different binders, teachers who are posting materials here, some are posting there, all of those things. And you're asking that 7th grader who probably has the executive function skills of a 4th grader to manage all of those activities. So now it starts to make perfect sense. No wonder the wheels are falling off the bus, right? So, when we work with students, what we try to do is teach them the skills and also support them until the brain catches up, right? Because eventually it will, but you've got to use tools and strategies along the way to sort of accelerate that process.
Yeah, and to that point, that's why we don't want to say, "Oh, you'll eventually get this," or "You'll figure it out on your own," because they may later on, but the truth is, in that time, they need the supports and the structure and
Right.
strategies. And
Absolutely.
we often think it's a motivational issue when actually it's a skill-based issue.
Yeah.
So why is it that you mentioned why it gets harder in elementary or from elementary to middle school, but we also see this other time period when kids go from middle school to high school and even from ninth grade to 11th grade.
Yeah.
What happens there?
Yeah. So if you think about a student who's struggling with executive function, typically when parents call me, they say they did great in elementary school. This was not a problem. Middle school started to get a little rocky. Ninth grade, oh my gosh, everything's a disaster, right? So you have to remember that the student doesn't have the tools and strategies. They don't have the systems in place. And maybe they haven't been academically challenged until they get to high school. Now they're being academically challenged. Now there's a lot of rigor. Now there's just a lot more expectations and workload, and they don't have the system. So they get completely overwhelmed because nothing is in place for them. And also, don't forget when you move from a middle school model to a high school model, you are leaving that nice little bird nest where you have six teachers, all sitting together every single day to talk about all the students, putting eyes on the students. There are multiple people sort of watching your child in middle school. When you get to high school, it's sort of like a free range chicken, right? They're out there by themselves just running around. So the guardrails are gone. So this is when you start to see if a student doesn't have someone kind of helping them to improve these skills, this is when you see things start to go awry.
Yeah, and definitely when kids, even when they get to their junior year and they're taking a lot of AP classes or IB or dual enrollment, and now the expectations are heightened. So anytime we
Absolutely.
see that the expectations change, maybe if your executive function skills were okay, now, not so much because the demands are different, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't forget too, with executive function, if we have a student who's not turning things in on time, who's getting behind, right? Then when you get into those more rigorous classes, now you're starting to have skill gaps too. So it really becomes a vicious circle.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to think about, okay, what can I do to support my child so that it doesn't come to that? Tell us about the summer slide.
Yeah. When I was teaching, I taught seventh grade for most of my career, and it never failed. By about the end of September every year, the eighth grade teachers would come to us and say, "We know you taught them this. We know you did XYZ." And we'd say, "Yep, we did." And they'd say, "Well, they're acting like they've never seen it." There is a drop off over the summer. And, I always use the analogy of you're in a really good habit of going to the gym, right? So you go 3 times a week, you're in a good habit, you get injured, you stop going for 6 weeks. It's so much harder to start to go again, right? You have filled your calendar with other things. You're sore, you're tired, you're not motivated. So think about when that happens. The kids have been on the beach all summer, or they've been playing video games, or they've been hanging with their friends. They're having a great time. But when school starts again, it's almost like they have to relearn how to do school, right? So I strongly encourage and always have when I was teaching in the role I'm in now, some type of academic something over the summer, even if it's once a week. Twice a week is great, but even if you can fit in once a week, because what happens in that time is you can, first of all, work on any skill gaps that might have ended with the closing school year, right? Things that are a little fuzzy. So, reading skills, multiplication facts, study skills, whatever it is. And then also, it keeps the students in some academic frame of mind over the summer. So, it's not all forgotten, right? And then it eases the transition in the fall. So kids that work with a coach over the summer, once assignments do start rolling in, and there are 6 classes and teachers are posting in multiple places, they've built a relationship with the coach, they're in a groove, they're in a rhythm, and it eases that transition. So you don't have 5 or 6 weeks at the beginning of the school year where everything is going crazy and they're, come October, they're already 10 assignments behind. So you can really prevent that by having them do some type of engagement with some support over the summer.
Thank you for that, Kathy. I know you're a big proponent of meeting kids where they are because, truthfully, when kids come to us, they're always in a different place. No child is ever the same.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean, and how does it work?
Yeah. So this is so important. And it's really what we base all of our coaching around. There's something called the stages of change model, and that is a continuum of readiness for behavior change. So our coaches do sort of a soft assessment when they first meet with the students to determine where they are on that continuum. And that helps them know how they're going to approach the session with the student. And what, are they going to come in the front door? Are they going to knock gently on the side door? How are they going to do that? And one of the things that we use that I'm really excited about is when our coaches work with students during the school year, typically they use the students' work, their own work, their papers, their tests, whatever it is, as the vehicle through which to practice the skills. If there isn't work, like it's summer, or maybe sometimes elementary kids don't have a lot of work coming home, we have a research-based curriculum that we use. And later this week, my colleagues are going to talk a lot more about this. But the curriculum is modular in nature, so they don't have to do the entire thing from A to Z. And in the first session, they do one of these executive function skills assessments through a series of questions that the student answers. Then we know where they are, right? And we know what areas are the most problematic for them. So the coach isn't going to waste time working on things the student's already good at, because the curriculum provides a list of like the top 10 activities and lessons that are going to be most effective for that student. Okay. And it's done again in the virtual setting, but the curriculum is very interactive. It's very engaging. And again, you'll get more details later in the week, but it's very structured. It follows the same format each time, but there's a little video clip. There's a game piece. The student is engaging on screen with the coach, actually manipulating the screen. So they're not just sitting watching a shared screen. And it's very effective. And that way, they meet the student where they are and take them to where they need to be. So it's very customized for each student.
Kathy, earlier you talked about resistant kids, and I know through an executive function assessment, we can see, what they need to work on, but what if the child doesn't really want to work on those things?
Yeah, that's a big one. So what you really have to do is start with like very small pieces. And sometimes when we have kids that are really, really resistant, and I mean, we have kids that come in, they don't want to be there. They're saying, I hate you, mom and dad, for making me do this. That's not the norm, but we've had it. Sometimes the coaches just have to spend a little more time on the relationship building piece first. And they might go in what I always call like a side door. So when I'm on the phone with parents and I get all the information about the student, I also ask about what do they like to do outside of school? What are their interests? What are their passions? What are their hobbies? Because that gives our coach something else to discuss with the student, or something to compare to. So for example, if we have a student who's an incredible soccer player, right? Well, how did you get to be a great soccer player? Well, I went to practice every day, or I did the skills I was supposed to do at night, or that. And then you can say, okay, so that worked so well for you in sports. Let's talk about how that might work for you in academics, right? So you just take little pieces at a time. But once you start that practice piece, like sometimes it just takes the initiating the task that one time, you start to build momentum for the student. They start to feel a little confidence in what they're doing. And then the momentum actually, they gain confidence, they're doing well. And that's what eventually builds the motivation. So then the student will kick in and kind of take over on their own.
Thank you, Kathy. I know one of my kids was really resistant and working with me, kind of what you mentioned at the beginning. I'm like,
Yeah.
wait, you don't understand. I do this for a living.
They don't care, right?
No, he wanted nothing to do with it. And then, of course, I had an executive function coach from when it wasn't going well between the two of us. And he said, oh, yeah, we worked on this whole calendaring system. And it was pretty much the same thing I tried to get him to do,
What
but
you
he
had
thought it was
said.
a great idea from her. So that often happens for
Yeah,
sure.
it does.
So I know later in the week we're talking about other things that have to do with kids. Explain to us what's going on day 2, day 3, and also, if you have time, Kathy, let's go to questions in just a moment because I'm thinking of some things that parents may wonder about. And so if you do have a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And Melissa, I think that you're going to come on in just a second and read some of the questions out to us. So Kathy, tell us what's going on the rest of the week.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. I've blocked my calendar to see the next couple of webinars. So tomorrow, the webinar is building age-appropriate executive function skills in the elementary years, because those should not be neglected, right? And that's some of the sort of being a good classroom citizen, starting early with organizational skills, with your backpack, with the homework folder, things like that, that are going to build those systems in place before they get to middle school, for example. And that's with two of our very veteran, very seasoned executive function coaches that work here with us. And then on Thursday, it's really about middle school. And again, two of the coaches that have worked here for a long time, lots of time in the classroom, lots of time working with neurodivergent students. And again, the middle school time, it's so significant because it's just a whole change up from elementary school, right? They have to build those skills. Middle school is when you learn how to learn. And that's important. And then that carries over into high school. So if you're a parent watching this right now and thinking, well, I have a high school kid, it would still behoove you to watch the middle school webinar because it's all the same skills. It's just the way it gets approached or the way it gets delivered or the way it gets applied is going to be a little different depending on the age, but it's the exact same sort of cadre of executive function skills, regardless of age.
Yeah, that's important to know. Thank you for that, Kathy. All right. And also, how can parents get in touch with you if they have a question or want to schedule a
Yeah,
call?
so if they want to book a call with me, they can scan the QR code. They can also go to the website and you can select an appointment with any of the program managers. So it's myself and then my colleague Ann Stewart Kirkhorn and Jennifer Gonzalez. You can see their smiling faces on screen. You could choose with them too. And you'll put yourselves on the calendar. That's what I love. I wake up in the morning and I don't know who's going to be on it, and I look at my calendar and it's full of all these people that I get to talk to.
Wonderful, Kathy. I know parents always love talking to you. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
I love being your guest, Ann. Thank you for asking me.
Thanks. You always provide such wonderful advice and insight on these common issues, but that can also be very tricky. So parents, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I hope it was helpful. And we would love to see you on Wednesday and Thursday. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.